Hello everyone, I hope you're having a wonderful day. Today, we're going to step into one unforgettable candlelit night when Jack invites Tu Tien in, dances with her under soft piano music, and finally drops to one knee to ask the question that could change their lives forever. If you enjoy the story, don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the next videos. In the soft, dim glow of candlelight, the apartment felt smaller than usual, as if the evening itself had stepped closer to watch. The steady ticking of the wall clock filled the silence, each second passing with the kind of weight that only comes when someone is waiting for a moment that could change everything. Jack stood alone in the kitchen, one hand holding a clean white plate, the other slowly wiping its rim with a cloth, even though it didn't need wiping anymore. He had already checked every plate twice, adjusted every glass, straightened every fold of the tablecloth, but his hand still needed something to do. Across the room, on the table set for two, a small black velvet ring box rested beside a vase of deep red roses. It didn't move, it didn't demand anything, and yet it pulled his eyes back to it again and again like it had its own gravity. He inhaled slowly. The scent of fresh herbs rose from the soup simmering on low heat. Beneath that was a softer sweetness of vanilla from the dessert he had baked himself carefully, nervously, like a man trying to turn feeling into something visible. Everything in the room had been chosen with intention. The crisp white tablecloth, the candles placed at just enough distance to glow without crowding the table, the polished cutlery, the roses standing dark and rich in the warm light. None of it was random. Every detail carried the same quiet message, one he had been trying to express for much longer than this one evening. She deserves beautiful things. She deserves to be cared for. She deserves to walk into a room and feel that someone thought of her in every corner of it. Jack set the plate down and looked at the ring box again. For a second, he just stood there, listening to the clock, to the soft bubbling in the kitchen, to his own breathing. Then he crossed the room and opened the box one last time. The stone caught the candlelight at once. It didn't flash loudly. It shimmered, warm and clear, like something alive. Jack stared at it longer than he meant to. Not because he doubted it, because he suddenly felt the full weight of what it meant. This wasn't just jewelry. It was a question, a promise, a risk, a moment that would ask him to step fully out from behind all the small gestures, the careful patience, the affection he had hidden inside routine. A smile touched his lips, small, private, almost disbelieving. "Today is your day," he whispered. Then the doorbell rang. The sound cut cleanly through the apartment and through his thoughts. Jack straightened so quickly it almost made him dizzy. His fingers trembled once as he closed the ring box and placed it back exactly where it had been. He pressed his palms briefly against the edge of the table, grounding himself. Then he walked to the door. The distance between the dining room and the entrance was only a few steps, but it felt longer tonight. In those few seconds, months of quiet affection, unsaid longing, and patient hope seemed to gather and rise inside him all at once. He paused with his hand on the doorknob, chest tight, and understood with perfect clarity that what he was about to offer was not only a ring. It was the courage to be known fully. He opened the door. Hallway light spilled in across the floor in a soft golden stripe, and there she was. Tu Tien stood framed in the doorway, her silk dress falling cleanly along her body, her hair loose over her shoulders, still carrying the faint floral scent of the afternoon. For one suspended second, Jack didn't move. He simply looked at her. She had arrived exactly on time, exactly as he had hoped, and somehow she still took him by surprise. Tu Tien's eyes lifted to his face first, then moved past him into the apartment. The candlelight, the roses, the table. Her expression changed slowly. Beautifully curiosity first, then surprise, then something softer and deeper, something that made her eyes shine before she even said a word. Jack stepped forward and drew her gently into his arms. He didn't hold her too tightly, only enough for her to feel the truth of him, the heartbeat beneath his shirt, the breath he had been trying to steady all evening, the emotion he could no longer hide. Behind calm hands and careful preparation, her warmth settled against him instantly. Her breath brushed the side of his neck. The familiar scent of her light, clean, comforting made something inside him loosen and ache at the same time. "You're so beautiful," he whispered. The words came out rougher than he intended. Tu Tien leaned back just enough to look up at him. Their eyes met, and the room around them seemed to recede. For a long second, it felt as if the apartment had narrowed until there was only this doorway, this light, this breath between them. Jack bent and pressed a quiet kiss to her forehead. Then he took her hand. He didn't let go as he led her inside. The door closed softly behind them with a quiet click that sounded, to Jack, strangely final and strangely tender. Not like something shutting, like something beginning. Tu Tien stepped farther into the room and stopped. The candles flickered gently across the table, sending warm light over the crystal glasses and the folds of the white cloth. The roses sat at the center, deep red and almost velvety in the glow. For a moment, she simply stood there, taking it all in. One hand still in Jack's, the other rising slowly toward her mouth. "You did all of this," she said, voice catching. "For me?" Jack looked at her, and for once he didn't try to make the answer casual. "Yes," he said softly, her eyes filled before the tears had fully formed. She lowered her hand, still looking around as though she were afraid the room might dissolve if she moved too quickly. Jack pulled out her chair with quiet care and waited until she sat, then took his seat across from her. The distance between them wasn't far, but it held its own intimacy, close enough to feel the warmth of the moment, open enough to let it breathe. He picked up the bottle and poured deep red wine into her glass. The liquid swirled slowly, catching the candlelight in dark, rich curves. "To your day," he said, lifting his own glass. Tu Tien smiled and raised hers. The crystal touched with a light, clear sound that rang softly in the room. They began with the appetizer, fresh greens, lightly dressed, thin slices of creamy cheese, small bites that let the meal unfold slowly instead of rushing it. And that was exactly how Jack wanted it. Not a performance, not a dramatic event that passed too quickly, a slow evening, one long breath. Tu Tien spoke first about ordinary things. Her day, the small pressures she usually kept tucked away, the little frustrations that didn't sound important enough to say out loud most of the time. But tonight, under this light, in this attention, she let them come. Jack listened without interrupting. His eyes stayed on her face, not in a forced way, but in the way of someone who had decided that nothing else in the room mattered more. Once, when she paused and looked down as if wondering whether she was saying too much, his hand moved across the table and rested lightly over hers. It was not a dramatic gesture. It didn't need to be. It said, "Keep going, I'm here." Tu Tien looked at his hand over hers, then back at him, and something in her face softened all over again. "I know today matters to you," Jack said quietly after a while. "So I wanted you to feel truly loved." The sentence left him exposed in a way that no business risk ever had. He felt it the moment the words were spoken. But when Tu Tien lowered her gaze and smiled with tears brightening at the edges of her eyes, he knew he didn't regret a single syllable. She turned her hand beneath his and held on, and in that small shift in shared food, slow conversation, fingers meeting in candlelight, the evening moved from beautiful into something deeper, something honest, something they had both been walking toward for a long time, even before either of them was ready to name it. Jack rose from his chair and carried the main course in with both hands, moving carefully enough that the steam did not spill too quickly into the room. He had practiced this part in his mind all afternoon: walk steadily, do not look nervous, set the plates down smoothly. But when he reached the table, his fingers still trembled. The scent arrived before the plates fully touched the cloth. Seared beef, red wine reduction, butter, herbs, warmth. It wrapped itself around the candles and roses and made the apartment feel fuller. He set Tu Tien's plate in front of her first, then his own, and returned to his seat. For a moment, he did not pick up his knife or fork. He just looked at her. Under the candlelight, familiar things about her face seemed newly revealed. The line of her mouth when she was trying not to smile too much. The way her lashes lowered when she felt something deeply. Tu Tien lifted her eyes and caught him watching. "What?" she asked softly. Jack smiled. "Nothing," he said. "I just like looking at you." Her cheeks warmed visibly. She lowered her eyes to the plate and shook her head once, but the smile remained. They began to eat slowly. No one hurried. The sound of cutlery against porcelain stayed soft. Outside, the city continued its distant pulse beyond the windows, but inside the apartment, everything had narrowed into candlelight, breath, and the warmth of food prepared by hand. At first, the conversation stayed easy. Tu Tien spoke about the tiring days, the moments when she felt surrounded by people and still somehow alone. The sleepless hours she never fully explained because saying them aloud made them heavier. Jack listened with the kind of stillness that told her he was not waiting for his turn to speak. Once, halfway through a sentence, she laughed softly and looked down at her glass. "I do not know why I'm telling you all this tonight," she said. Jack set his fork down. "Maybe because tonight you do not have to carry it by yourself," he replied. That landed deeper than either of them expected. Tu Tien was quiet for a moment after that, fingertips resting against the stem of her glass. When she looked up again, her eyes held something fragile and unguarded. "You've always done that," she said. "Even when I said nothing, you always somehow knew when to stay close." Jack's expression changed just slightly. "I will not promise you the whole world," he said, voice slower now. "But I can promise you this. Every part of my world that is mine to give, I will use to protect you." Tu Tien stopped eating completely. Her hand moved across the table and closed around his. Her fingers were warm. Jack turned his hand beneath hers and held on. For a long moment, neither of them said anything. They simply looked at each other across the candles while the steam from their plates thinned into the air. There are moments when love does not arrive dramatically. It clarifies. The rest of the meal moved gently after that. They spoke less, but the silence between them was no longer waiting to be filled. It had become part of the intimacy itself. When they finished the main course, Jack stood and walked to the speaker near the window. A slow piano piece drifted into the room. He turned back to her and held out his hand. "Dance with me," he said. She laughed once, quietly, and placed her hand in his. The moment their fingers met, a subtle current passed between them, deep and familiar, like something that had been building for a long time and had finally found its shape. Jack drew her gently to her feet and led her into the open space between the table and the window, where candlelight and streetlight blended into a pale gold haze. They did not dance in any formal way. They simply began to sway. Jack's hand settled at the small of her back. His other hand held hers. The distance between them narrowed until their breaths began to fall into rhythm. Tu Tien rested her head against his shoulder and closed her eyes for one long second, listening. His heartbeat, steady, real, close enough to lean on. Jack lowered his face slightly, lips brushing the top of her hair. "I just want you to know," he whispered. "No matter what tomorrow brings, I'll be right here, holding you like this." The last part of the sentence caught in his throat. Tu Tien's grip tightened in his hand. Her eyes closed again, and tears slipped free, silent, warm, soaking a small patch of his shirt. He did not mention them. He just kept moving with her, slow and protective. This was not the kind of romance that shouted. It lived in presence, in the refusal to let go too early, in the way he held her as if she were precious. When the piano softened toward its end, Jack stopped moving. For a brief second, they stayed exactly where they were, his hand at her waist, hers still in his, both of them breathing the same air. Then he stepped back just enough to see her face. He drew in a slow breath. His free hand moved to the inner pocket of his jacket. Tu Tien's eyes widened immediately. Jack lowered himself to one knee. The floor was hard beneath him, but he barely felt it. His heart pounded so hard he was sure she could hear it. He looked up at her with the kind of vulnerability no one ever saw in him except here. "Tu Tien," he said, and his voice broke on her name before he steadied it again. "I'm not good with perfect speeches." A tear slipped down her cheek. "But I know this," he continued. "The day I met you, something in my life changed, and every quiet moment since then has only made me more certain. You are not just important to me. You are my peace, you are my courage, You are the place in my life where everything finally feels real." He opened the small black velvet box. The ring caught the candlelight at once and answered with a quiet, brilliant shimmer. Tu Tien covered her mouth, tears spilling freely now. Jack's own eyes had gone bright too. "Today, on the 8th of March, I want to ask you the one thing I've been carrying in my heart for so long." He drew one careful breath. "Will you let me love you like this for the rest of my life? Will you marry me?" Tu Tien nodded before she could speak, then nodded again harder, laughing and crying at once. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I will." Her hand trembled as she held it out to him. Jack took it and slid the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly. That was the moment that undid both of them. Jack rose quickly and pulled her into his arms, holding her so tightly it felt like he was trying to protect the answer she had just given from the rest of the world. Tu Tien buried her face in his chest and let herself cry there, not from fear, not from sadness, but from joy so overwhelming it had nowhere else to go. Time did not exactly stop, it just ceased to matter. By the time they sat down again, this time not at the table, but together on the sofa near the dying candles, the apartment felt changed, softer, closer. Jack draped one arm over her shoulders and took her left hand in his. Again and again, his thumb brushed lightly over the ring, as if he still needed proof that it was there. Tu Tien leaned against him, lifting her hand every few seconds to look at it. The stone caught each last flicker of candlelight like a small star that had chosen to stay. Jack bent and kissed the top of her head. "From now on," he murmured, "every March 8th will belong to this." Tu Tien turned and kissed him softly, no hesitation left, no distance left to protect. It was not a hurried kiss. It was an answer. Outside, the city still moved. Traffic lights changed, people crossed streets. Somewhere, a late motorbike passed beneath the window. But in this apartment, time had reached its sweetest point and decided to linger. The final candle went out a little while later. Neither of them moved to relight it. In a candlelit apartment filled with the scent of fresh herbs, soup, and homemade dessert, Jack prepares every detail for a night he hopes Tu Tien will never forget. When she arrives, stunned by the roses, white tablecloth, and glowing candles, he welcomes her with tenderness and leads her into an evening designed entirely around making her feel cherished. Over wine, salad, and a carefully cooked main course, they begin with simple conversation, then slowly open up about loneliness, pressure, and the quiet ways they have already been caring for each other. Their words turn into deeper confessions, and the emotional distance between them disappears. As soft piano music fills the room, Jack asks her to dance, holding her close and promising that no matter what tomorrow brings, he will stay by her side. Then, in the stillness after the music fades, he kneels, opens a velvet ring box, and asks Tu Tien to marry him. Through tears and joy, she says yes.